Good morning, everyone. Well, first of all, my apologies for not being able to give this presentation last week. You have to blame that on the Argentinians, your neighbors to the south, because they had a general strike, so I had to leave early. Otherwise, I would have been stuck for a few more days in either in Uruguay or in Argentina, and I needed to go back. Anyway, today we're going to talk about open science and what I call science or science fiction. And part of open science will also be a discussion about open access, but it's only a part of that. And we'll not have a lot of time talking about open science, so I encourage you to go further on this and look further. I will share my slides as a PDF after this. And for those of you who want to be able to see it back, I will even probably make the presentation available. Now, when we talk about science, we need to talk about whether science can be fake, because we'll talk about fake science, fake news, and we talked about that last week in the AI. And here you see an astronaut who's sitting up in the probably the International Space Station and looking down, and he's seeing a lot of storms approaching the coast of what seems to be Florida and the southern part of North America. And he says, "Houston, you have a problem," which is a wordplay on an old event that actually happened in Apollo 13 when they had to say, "Houston, we have a problem." Nevertheless, he looks down and he sees all these storms coming in. And as a matter of fact, you've probably seen the storms in the past few weeks in this, and you have to deal with the consequences. So here you see the freeway in Dallas after the Harvey storm in August of 2017. There's only one small problem with this. The road is for real, the car is for real, the shark is not for real. The shark is actually a shark type that comes off the coast of South Africa and not South America, or for that matter, even North America. And it was put in there using some very good science from a company called Adobe. It's actually used Photoshop. So by doing so, we are talking about open science, we're talking about trust in science, and that would be the trust in science from the general public and also the trust in science from our politicians. But sometimes, politicians can also make use of science, sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. And if you don't agree with it, just change it. So here we have President Trump when he was still a president, and today, as you probably know, is the election day in the US, and he might come back. And he decided that he didn't agree with the storm path that was predicted by the weather. So he decided to do it with a Sharpie pen because it would be benefiting for him politically if it would actually go in and hit Louisiana and some of the poorer states down there. In reality, it hit land here, and then it progressed up and beat up North Carolina, which is up here, very badly. Anyway, so to continue on, and now we're going really into the science, let's first define what we are talking about in science. And science is the pursuit and application of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So now we know what science is. What is open science? Well, open science is the practice of science in such a way that others can collaborate, contribute, where research data, lab notes, and other research processes are freely available under terms that enable reuse, redistribution, and reproduction of the research and its underlying data and methods. This is not something I came up with. It's actually a definition coming from a project, Foster project, which was facilitate open science training for European research, which was a EU project in 2014, sorry. This foster project had a number of participants. You can see a lot of them were from Northern Europe, Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, UK, Poland. We have a few from Portugal and one from Spain, but for the rest, it was mostly North European countries, relatively rich countries, and we'll discuss that later on when we talk about the open access part of it. So the principles in the open science is open methodology, open source, open data, open access, open peer review, open educational resources. And that has all been taken out of a UNESCO presentation that was presented on February 17th, 2021. So first, the European Union began a project on this, and were talking about how to implement this open science. They wanted to have more confidence from the general audience into the scientists, and one of the ways of doing that is to create more transparency. Then UNESCO came in and they reiterated on this, and they decided that open science was a very beneficial thing for especially not so wealthy countries, meaning that they would have access to open access to various resources, and also being able to read the literature without paying for it. Now, I'll not go into the details, but the question is that really open for interpretation? And I would recommend that you read the full text. It was dated in March 30th, 2021, and here is the number. In the preliminary report, countries of the UN had the option to report back on it and give their recommendations. 40 countries decided to do so, including North Korea, but unfortunately not two of the biggest ones, the United States and China, two of the biggest producing scientific communities in the world. They decided not to comment on it, and as a matter of fact, effectively not participating in this discussion. From Latin America, you will see that Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico, and Uruguay all responded to it in various degrees and had some comments to the original text. And some of these things were changed and implemented in the final text that you find up there on from 2021. So if you go to this website, you will be able to read about open science in general. So open science is much more than just open access. And as a matter of fact, UNESCO has even developed a checklist for a university. So if there's any of you involved in the university's politics, you should know that there is a checklist for all the various parts of this, because it takes care of things such as evaluation of you and young researchers or researchers in general. It talks about open access. It talks about ethics. Talks about access to equipment, things like that. So there's a lot of issues to it. So we can't go into all the details of this, but I would strongly recommend that if you're interested in the whole concept of open science, you need to go and look at this checklist. Mind you, you can't just subscribe to some of them. You really have to subscribe to all of them. The European Union have what they call the 8 pillars of open science, and many universities tend to agree with maybe 4, at the most 5 of them, and they try to subscribe to them and then decide not to implement the rest. That's not really the way it works. You're supposed to subscribe to all of them. Now, so among the open science principles, there's the open methodology, the open source, and the open data. I will not discuss that too much today, because I think many of you probably want to zoom in on the open access part of it. But I would like to mention the open data and the open source. It means that you should also deposit all your generated data in a repository that is accessible for other people without paying for it. It has to be open. Open access, that is talking about the scientific part of it, the open peer review, and the open educational resources. I will not discuss the last part too much because it's a very broad subject, and it's a very sensitive subject as well, because some people feel that that means that in reality there shouldn't be, or there couldn't be any private, or at least not, you should not be allowed to pay tuition to any public institutions that adhere to the open science principle. What I'll focus now on is more on the open access part of it, and I'll go all the way back to the first science writing, what I would call publishing 0.0. So we had scientists, and you might discuss in today's day and age whether we would consider the people involved in this to be scientists. But for that day and age, they were definitely scientists, and their observations and practices were often drawn up by hand, and sometimes painted on walls, or in this particular case, it was actually drawn up by Chinese scholars, different comet types. And here we have on the right-hand side the mummification steps used by the Egyptians to prepare the body for the afterlife. And both of them are to some extent scientific. The mummification steps involve various salts and what have you. And as a matter of fact, through the time period in Egypt, they actually forgot how to mummify it in a good and efficient way. And only when people reread sort of the original way of doing it, they ended up having a good method again. Now, the real publishing, what we consider to be publishing today, started in the time of the Enlightenment. And I write this as being Europe. It's not really true, because it was an Enlightenment that sort of the Western Hemisphere, I would say, predominantly. And before that, I fully agree, there was scientific publishing being done in the Arabic countries, especially in the math, and in Asia. But just in the publishing, as we call it today, where you had a regular issued books, was really in the time of the Enlightenment. And these so-called learned societies and Royal Academy of Sciences, they emerged throughout Europe, and I think also in some, especially South American countries. And science was still sort of for the privileged men, and men predominantly, and or they had to be extremely gifted. It was not common that if you're not wealthy and you are not extremely gifted, that you would be allowed to participate in science. And these learned societies were at the same time sort of the hub for these publishing. Now, what I call today's day and age publishing 2.0 is really about having the publisher central. At least that's what the publisher themselves think. And that is that you have people from the journal, from the publisher, soliciting and managing subscriptions. And there's a lot of submissions. Actually, it's more like 3 million today. A lot of them, and it goes around, and most of it is going on inside sort of the sphere of influence of the publishers. They subsequently then sell the subscription to their journals, and the various readers in the world will have to either pay for it or have someone else pay for the access to it. Now, if we now go on to sort of who is really involved in this publishing 2.0, the so-called stakeholders, that's the funding agency, that's the academic institutions, obviously the authors and the co-authors, the publishers, the editors, reviewers, libraries, and readers, and ultimately the real connection should be between the authors and the readers. Having said that, they all have some kind of a function in it. The funding agency obviously often funding the research going on. the academic institution often facilitating the infrastructure necessary to do the research, and the rest of them have pretty obvious positions in this. Now we are going to what I would call publishing 3.0, the open access time. Now, this is a chicken or egg principle. The question is, who's going to decide to go first? The institutions, the funding agencies, or the authors, and say, we are going now fully for open access? Or should the publishers say, no, we'll go now for full open access, and whatever you do, you have to pay to publishers? Both of it is very unattractable, and that means that most of the fully open access journals have been new journals launched by the publishers, either the existing publishers or new publishers. So this open access, which is part of the open science, it's publishing for the general public. Why? Well, there is no fee to read, ever. Funding agencies and governments might then actually decide where you can publish. Obviously, if they have an agreement with the publisher that they can publish in that journal for free, they all like you, not only like you, they will force you to publish in that journal. As a matter of fact, some funding agencies in certain countries will request that you publish in those journals, and only those journals will be considered if you want to have another grant from them. Many people believe that open access could mean one prize for all countries and all university systems. Reality shows that's not the case. Unfortunately, it's not very transparent. Every publisher tries to make an agreement with the various countries, and depending on how much money they can get, they will have different prices for the various countries. In principle, and we'll show that later on, your country or funding agency would pay for all the publications that do open access. Most open access journals charge once a paper has been accepted. Not when it's submitted, but when it's been accepted. So the question is obviously very clearly, what is the incentive for a journal not to accept a paper? Typical charge, and for those of you who have done it, will know that it's 2,500 US dollars for the sort of cheaper open access, and it can go up all the way to in excess of 5,000 US dollars. There is something called parasitic journals, and these are journals that either look very similar to the name of another journal, or they are a journal from a publisher that is not well established and doesn't have a very solid background, and they can undercut this price, obviously make it cheaper. They can publish, and once they have their money, and then in a few years, they can just disappear, because there is no money being earned from the sustained presence on the web. There's also another aspect of your open access, and we'll return to that later on. That is that there's no incentive for the publisher to promote or support published material beyond 2 to 3 years. 2 to 3 years is what is called the impact factor horizon, or the side score horizon. So anything that is older than that doesn't contribute to the side score or to the impact factor of the journal. And that means that there's no incentive for them to either support it or to promote it. Whereas in a subscription model, most subscription models will gain access to all past publications, all from a certain year, but then a year way back, maybe 15 years ago, 2010 or so. But for open access, there is no incentive to not to support that. Now, it sounds like a great idea, publishing for the general public and open science. And what is the idea behind? And I would definitely emphasize that I am afraid that many different parties in this have different ideas of what they think about it. From the politicians' point of view, they think that, well, the taxpayer paid for this research, so we should all be able to read it for free. So also the general public. As a scientist, my argument would be, but most people would not be able to understand it. So what's it worth for them? Will they actually spend the time, or will they just quote whatever they need to quote to make their point? Another point that the politicians have said is that people don't appreciate the work done by scientists because they can't access it. Another argument being used is that price barriers should not prevent students or anyone from getting access to research they need. However, it will also require a restart of most journals and new journals. As I said, it's very tough to go from one day from a subscription model to go into a open access, because either you make the whole back catalog you have still a subscription part, and in the future you have to pay for it. That's a very tough decision, and I don't think any publisher has really done that in an adequate way. So in many ways, and that was the hope from some, especially among some scientists here in Europe, and we'll talk about what's called Plan S in a moment, was that it would lead up to the breakup of these old established publishing companies. What is called the Mother Bell breakup in the 80s in the US. That was a big telephone company. They were so powerful that they had a monopoly on doing things, so they could decide the prices, and then the government broke them up, and it became much cheaper. But on the same time, the amount of investments in the infrastructure also diminished. If we all pay the same, just imagine that we pay the same to publish, it would become cheaper for the richer countries, unless they have to pay for the waivers for others. There was another incentive that was not maybe in so many words explicitly said in the Plan S, but we'll get to that in a second. So there is a reference here where you can read about this. It's called righttoresearch.org. Now, Plan S, and you might say, did it start out with Plan A and then B and C? I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows what it's called Plan S, but it was a initiative by various European funding agencies, and it was to some extent related to the project I talked about earlier, the Foster project. And it was done by the European Union and the European Research Council, ERC, and WHO. So once again, the United Nations. So the United Nations was in over this. And it's a very long list of things, but just to give you some of them, and I'll give you the PDF and you can read it back. But it means that you, as an author, you would retain the copyright, but it also gives a lot of emphasis to what the publisher should do. So publication should be, fees should be covered by the funders and the universities, not individual researchers. And such publication fees should be standardized and capped. Standardized is what I said, it means that we would all have to pay the same. Universities, research organizations, and libraries should align their policies and strategies. Well, that's, even with a small country in the Netherlands, that's almost impossible. And once again, they are talking about members of this coalition. So it's like a coalition that is sort of up against this other big, company, publishing companies. And it should say that it requires scientists and researchers to benefit from state-funded research organizations to publish their work in open repositories and in journals that are available to all by 2021. Not to disappoint anyone, but in 2021, COVID had hit and we all had trouble getting our things together. And in many ways, Plan S to some extent died with COVID, but not fully. But there's also a lot of criteria for the open access journals and platforms. So it also says that the publisher should give details about the publishing cost. That would be the indirect cost and the direct cost, as well as the potential surplus. That would be their earnings. How much money do they make out of this? And they have to be transparent and be openly available on the journal website publishing platform. So really what they're saying is that we require the companies to tell us exactly how they make their money and where they make their money. You can imagine that there is no company in the world that is willing to do that. As a matter of fact, not even the societies. Well, you just saw that the US as a whole didn't participate in that, so we can discount the ACS and the APS. But for the IOP or Royal Society in the UK, they are not going to do that either. Why? Because sometimes you have to lose money in order to make a good journal, and sometimes you make money on a journal that may not seem all that profitable. And it also says that there has to be a link to raw data and code in external repositories. The interesting thing is that there are very few countries in the world that have initiatives to make these depositories. Even in Germany, which is as you may know, one country, but still has various states in it. Only a few of these states within the big country of Germany has decided to make these depositories. And as a matter of fact, the states that have decided to make these depositories are some of the least research intensive states in the country. There's also a very, very important part I've highlighted with red here, and that is that automatic article processing charge waivers for authors from low-income countries and discounts for authors from middle must be provided. And Mirror Journal, which one part being subscription-based and the other part being open access, are considered to be de facto hybrid journals. Mirror journals are not compliant with Plan S unless they are part of a transformative agreement. So here we have to talk about, we'll get back to that once again in a second. What is a hybrid journal? What is an open access journal? Well, we've talked about open access now. An open access journal means that everything in that journal is accessible to everyone to read for free forever. A hybrid journal is a journal that has partly subscription material and partly open access. And a fully non-open access is a purely subscription-based journal. Well, today, most journals are hybrid journals. But why can't I just read it for free? Why do I have to pay for it? That's a question I often get asked. And last week we talked about using various softwares. Well, because it costs money to do all the work. So some way or another, there has to be some money involved in it. It costs money to keep the computers running. Whenever you ask a question to Scopus, it costs money. Whenever you ask a website to find a website, a web page, it costs money. So it costs money. But then the counter question is, or the counter answer is, but I don't pay for Facebook, Google, or Twitter, or for ChatGPT for that matter. And I can also read the news for free. So what on science? Well, the point is that yes, you do get access to Google for free, but in reality, you pay with your information. That applies to Twitter, that applies to Facebook, that applies to WeChat, what have you. You pay with the information you have. Unfortunately, the information we can give the publishers is not truly worth enough to sustain this model. So Google can only do this because the information they gain from giving you the right answer to the right question is good enough, because you end up buying something that you found on a page that Google had linked, and therefore paying for your usage of Google. The next question we can ask us is, do we really need peer review? Can we just await the reaction for the readers? And the answer to that is, we have these depositories. They exist and they're used. For those of you who know any high energy physicists, they don't publish in hybrid journals. They don't publish in open access journals. They most often publish their things on depositories, and in these depositories, people can comment on them, and people do that in a decent and orderly manner. Unfortunately, most of these platforms, as we talked about, the Twitters and the Facebook and what have you, there is very few moderators, and people are not in any way, shape, and form restrained from having very nasty comments to the positions raised on the page. However, in high energy physics, it's done, and it could easily be done also in chemistry and physics for that matter. We're just not used to that. Now, we should also be careful that if we publish everything on the internet, and especially in open access, we know that the politicians and the money funding agencies will read, and we might end up with an oversimplification, the big headlines, the press releases, because we have found something so incredibly interesting, and then it might not be all that interesting from a scientific point of view. And last but not least, who's going to monitor about fake science and fake news? Typically, if things get on a depository and it's some way or another fake, either people don't bother discussing it, or if they do discuss it, they'll just disregard it as being fake. Let me make probably some personal side notes to this, because I think each one of you probably have some ideas of how you think about open access, and I will do that from a personal point of view. As you probably know, I'm editor-in-chief of a large journal, 20,000 submissions last year. But I've been also involved in a number of open access journals, actually been editor of 2 of them. Well, actually editor-in-chief of 1 of them, and been involved in that, but had to scale back because of my other journal. So I've been on both sides, so I don't have any preference, but I just want to mention a number of observations about this. One of them is that real hybrid journals do not treat open access submitted papers any different than non-open access submitted papers, meaning whether you upfront in the very beginning tell the journal, oh, I will pay for my paper if it's getting published, you will be treated, your paper should be treated and will be treated just the same way as any other paper. There is no difference in the workflow. In principle, there should be no difference in the editorial standards between fully open journals and hybrid journals. I say in principle because in reality, there is sometimes some difference. And here's the big one. Publishing a gold open access paper is not a measure of quality. It's a measure of your access to resources directly or indirectly. Whether you consider your own personal resources or those of your grant or somebody else's valuable enough for you, it doesn't mean that that particular paper is better than any other paper. It just means that you had the resources to pay for that. So if the funding agencies thinks that there is a difference between open access papers and unopen access papers, just wait a second and I'll show you that is not the case. Gold open access journals are also vulnerable to what is called paper mills. I don't know whether you've ever heard of this, but paper mills are basically scientists or groups of scientists that have decided to make money out of making their science available for co-authors to sign up and become co-authors for a fee. And that means that by having other authors pay for their being a co-author, they have enough surplus that they can pay for the open access fee. And since some open access journals are not too careful about checking the submitted papers, they are more vulnerable, I would say as vulnerable, if not more, than regular journals. And paper mills are a huge issue. They're also more prone to what is called citation manipulation. And that has to do with the fact that some publishers encourage you to cite their own journal in order to generate a higher impact factor. Publishers that only publish gold open access journals rely solely on the revenues from publishing charges, meaning that at the moment that your paper has been accepted, there is no more money to be made out of that paper. No one is going to pay for access to that paper in the future, ever. So they are paid upfront, and that also means that the company is worth no more than the number of papers they have actually accepted that year. And that also means that typically gold open access journals have higher acceptance rates than non-golden open access or hybrid journals. Our journal has an acceptance rate of about 17%, which is very low and is incredibly inefficient. If we were to make it a fully open access, I think we would have fewer submissions, but at the same time, the quality might not be all that much better. Just a piece of warning, there was a publisher called Hindavi. It was originally founded by a couple in Egypt, later on relocated to London. And they have for the past, I guess 28 years now, been in the publishing business, and they ended up selling their business in 2021 to Wiley. And after Wiley had purchased the company, it turned out that there is a lot of ethical issues in the various journals, and as a matter of fact, as a consequence, not only did the CEO lose his job, or as they said, he decided to retire, and but the brand name Hindavi that they pay so much money for will disappear, and the journals that are still in business will be integrated into the Wiley brand name. Another piece of warning, that is that several open access journals have actually been delisted by Clarivate. That means that they will have no impact factor. So when you submit a paper to a journal, that being an open access, hybrid, or fully non-open access subscription-based model, you also subscribe to their editorial model and therefore also their editorial consistency, and thereby also the faith that they will have an impact factor in the future. Now, Clarivate has been reducing the number of journals they want to index, and they are now also reviewing a lot of journals for which they think that they're actually not ethically all that great, and some of them have been delisted, quite a few actually, as a matter of fact, and also Elsevier journals, some of them very big. And just to show you a trend, as I said, China and the United States have not really fully subscribed to open access. China is a little bit more open up to it than the US, but one of their universities, not the very, very top university, say Gongshang University in Hangzhou, they decided that they would no longer include articles published in Hindavi MDPI and Frontiers journals when evaluating research performance. So you also have to be thinking about what happens if my university would decide not to accept publications in certain journals that I've used. So I just want to emphasize that not all open access is the same kind of open. There are various kinds. There's the gold. That's what we are talking about. Publisher makes to articles fully accessible on the journal website under a Creative Commons or similar license. And APC, that's an article publication fee, is usually paid by the author or other funder. Then you have the hybrid gold and open access. That's the subscription model where journal where the publisher allows authors to pay for individual open access, and they differ from the gold open access because the library or other subscriber is still paying for a subscription to the journal. And then they say in the definition, so effectively the publisher is paid twice for the article. That's not really true. Actually, in most journals, they will discount all the gold open access journals. Then we have the diamond platinum. Very rare. I don't know of anyone in chemistry and physics, but those are journals that are open access, but you don't have to pay for them. And they're either funded by institutions, advertising or philanthropy or what have you, some rich guy. You're not always sure that they will be indexed. It's not always for sure that they will remain running forever, but they are considered to be open access. And then you have the bronze version, which are journals that are free to read online, but not have a license. So they're not generally available for reuse. And then the green refers to self-archiving, generally of the pre and post-print of articles in repositories. And that is typically for most journals in the Elsevier house the case. Our journal allows you to deposit your article in the pre-print version of your article. Now, here is the good question. So how is Gold Open Access doing in Uruguay? Let's take a institute like the Faculty of Chemistry, I guess, and I don't know whether pharmacy is actually part of it. I don't think so. But from 2014 until today, there was 1,795 publications, of which 336 were gold open access, 68 were hybrid gold open access, 89 were bronze open access, and 332 were green open access. Now we go to 2023, because obviously we're not done quite with the 2024 yet, although some people have already published in 2025 issues. Not everything is in for 2024, so we'll go to 2023. Oh, it should have said 2023, sorry. No, sorry, in 2024, sorry. 2014, sorry. This was the total, the first one. In 2014, there was 101, 8 gold, 3 hybrid, 4 bronze, and 19 green open access. And in 2023, 178 publications, 60 gold open access. So that really increased dramatically. 12 hybrid, 12 bronze, and 32. So not only do you see that you're publishing more in 2023 than in 2014, at the same time, we know that the acceptance rate has gone down. So that probably means that you're submitting many more papers than you did in 2014. I don't know how many more people you are in 2023 compared to 2014, but you're at least publishing much more. Now, the million-dollar question, or maybe I should say the billion pesos question, and whether it's Argentinian, Uruguayan pesos, or for that Chilean pesos, it's the same question. Do open access papers outperform the non-open access papers? Because that's the reason why you're here today. You want to know, am I better off doing open access? Where do I find the money? Well, I cannot tell you where to find the money, but ideally, according to the various programs, that should actually be your funding agency. And your funding agency will see, well, you have a grant, you either pay it out of the grant or you have to pay from the university. So in 2014, 28 open access papers got in total of 880 citations. That means an average of 31.4, which is actually a very good number. So in 2014, 73 non-open access papers got 2465 citations. So as a matter of fact, a higher average citations, 33.4. But both of these numbers are very impressive in my opinion. And if we look at the distribution of citations, I know it's a little difficult to see, but this is the distribution for the open access papers in 2014. So you can see that there's a few of them that have very high numbers of citations. They weigh in very heavily on the open access part of it, and then it dies off. And there's even a single one, despite the fact that it was an open access, that has never had a single citation. So now you're probably wondering, how about 2023? Now in 2023, there's the 93 open access papers got 318 citations, on average 3.5. And in 2023, 98 non-open access papers got 290 citations, average 3.0. Aha, conclusion, of course, is that open access is much better today than it was in 2014. Hold your horses. It's not that easy. It's not that easy for the simple fact that the so-called cited half-life of a golden open access journal is typically much shorter than that of a regular hybrid journal. So you go for, it might be a short-term gain versus a long-term gain, meaning that if you expect to have your evaluation of your position or your grants or what have you within the next 2 years, you might be better off in open access journals. But if you want to win the big prizes or you want to have a good collaborations for a longer period, you're probably better off, for now at least, to go for the hybrid journals. Mind you, this is all based on very, very small numbers. And here on the right-hand side, you'll see the citation distribution for the open access in 2023. Same pattern, a few with a very high citation numbers, and then it dies off. And as a matter of fact, since this is only about 1.5 years old, there are still some that have no citation whatsoever. Now with this, we are now at, we've been going on for almost 47, 48 minutes. I think we have some time for some questions. So I suggest that if you have a question, please use the chat or open up your microphone and ask the question. With this, I would like to end with a citation from Mark Twain. And he said, lies, damn lies, and then statistics. And obviously many of the things I've shown here, the last few slides, were statistics, so it might as well have been a very damn lie. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Henry, for this very, very interesting presentation. And thanks for this brief analysis from the Uruguayan perspective, possibilities, and many, many questions directly related to the possibility of countries like ours in this region of the world, in which there are many, many difficulties to access to funding for particular pursuing publications in very, very difficult cases. Argentina and Uruguay is more or less stable in comparison with Argentina, but in reference to financial support and funding from basic science and applied sciences is very, very low. So now we are dealing with the fact to decide which path to take in order to publish our work. So there are many, many possibilities, but many of our groups try to, for example, to publish in a conventional way because we don't have money to to pay for this with all these open access possibilities. But the question is, how is your opinion in a future for a country like ours? How feasible is in your opinion to access, for example, to these open access possibilities? Because our institution, for example, don't have it is in their own politics to for example, to pay for our own open access journals in order to access to the possibility to publish and to download the papers in this kind of situation. So what would be your opinion regarding this from the uh, South America perspective for publishing?
Yeah, I mean, let me try first to put on my glasses as coming from Northern Europe. That sort of, in many ways, sort of gave birth to this concept, and I know the various players in this had various ideas why they wanted to achieve that. I know sometimes scientists did this because they had the feeling that we are paying for these subscription-based publications, and they cost us a lot of money. And what we read in them is a lot of crap from authors from countries that don't pay to have their things published. Just imagine now if we pay to have published, they also paid, and they paid a fair amount, then there would be fewer papers and we didn't have to pay anything to access them. That was the sort of incentive of some of them. From the politicians' point of view in Europe, it was very much, and the European Union was a sort of idea of the fact that by making open science, because once again, it's not just about open access, it's about open science in general. It would be much more easily available for the companies to utilize the information generated by the scientists. However, in the process, they came to realize that at the same time, they would also give away the access to other entities outside of the European Union. And that's the dilemma that we are facing right now, because at the one hand side, they would like to make it available, but then only to the people who've actually contributed to the funding of this research. And so there is various players, but they got together to get this Plan S. Now, the UNESCO initiative is sort of a spin-off of this, and is obviously much bigger. But the biggest player in this, or the two biggest player on this, and one of them is having their election today. And in many ways, as you probably have followed in the news, that the belief and the trust in science is under pressure in the United States, because whenever you, as a politicians, do not agree with the science, you just say that it's just bullshit. To put it very bluntly, and they will say that for instance, the global warming is not an issue. It's just all calculations and theories, what have you, is not true. And so, in many ways, today, November 5th, 2024, can be a very pivotal moment in that respect, because if Donald Trump is going to win, there will be a huge cut in science funding for the United States, and therefore also a landslide in terms of how they are going about their publications. So in many ways, although because Uruguay is a small country, and now I've taken on the European, I've taken on the North American, and now going to South America. You're in a position, well, Uruguay is relatively speaking in South America probably better off than most, if not all, South American countries. But of course, compared to many countries in the world, it's still not as well off. But generally speaking, I think there's only one thing to do, and that is to go with the flow as a country. Meaning also as a scientist, but at the same time warn the people in charge of determining funding, as well as funding for the universities and for the science, that you cannot go all in on open access or go all in on non-open access, you will have to follow the flow and look at the model. And if you had asked me 3 years ago, I would have said gold open access is the future, and that's probably the only model that's going to happen. However, based on the many reactions from some of the bigger players in the scientific world, that being China, and their hesitance to include these gold open access publishers' work in their evaluations, might mean the slow death of these publishers. Mind you, that one of these big companies is MDPI, based in Switzerland, but actually the owner of that is a Chinese national. So it's not like that the Chinese government doesn't know what they're dealing with and how to deal with it. But bottom line is, my suggestion to everyone is that try to go with the flow. As a smaller country, you don't have any option to make a huge statement and saying, oh no, we are going full gold open access, because you never know what happens to these gold open access journals in the future. So I would suggest that you go with the best journal for the work that you have published. And if most of the things that you have referred to in your paper you've written is in gold open access, that might be the way to go. And then it's a matter of whether you can find the funds.
Thanks, Henrik. I don't know
Questions?
if anyone from the list of participants. Do you have another question? No?
Are you telling me it was all that clear?
Hello.
Hello,
I
Ines,
have a
go ahead.
question.
Yes.
A quick
Yes, thank
question.
you very
Sorry.
much.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask you your opinion about the latest decision from Clarivate to put on hold eLife, because based on the review the reviewers changes that they have made. I mean, I don't know, for it's kind of striking that a company will have that power on the decision of how scientists decided how, I mean, the work should be reviewed, peer reviewed. I don't know. I just wanted to have your opinion. Thank you.
Let me see if I understand you correctly. I mean, Clarivate makes the index, and that's their business model, and they sell the access to that index to various external partners. And so for them, it's also a matter of being so clear as possible and not invest too much money not too much money, investing enough money that they hold that they still have some money over to pay their shareholders. And Clarivate is maybe to the same extent as some European countries, is a little sick and tired of all these many publications that are probably of questionable quality and may even be paper mills. And so Clarivate has been going through with some algorithms they have developed themselves and that are not totally transparent, and they have decided to delist some of these journals, and then the big discussion in some institutions is whether these papers then still can be considered, for instance, the calculation of the age index, and whether they can be used to calculate the average index. Yeah, it's true. It's a scary thought that they have so much power in that. And there's actually basically only two players in this game at the moment. That's Scopus and that's Web of Science, Clarivate. And Clarivate is not very good at communicating with the journals and the publishers about their motives for delisting. But they will, if you insist, they will actually give you some information, but they will only give you the information afterwards. So they have a warning list that is not public, and that's actually shared with some of the publishers, but only on an individual basis. And that warning list can be for individual issues. We had one case about 5 years ago where we had a paper that has not been labeled as being a review paper, sorry. And since it had a lot of reference, because typically a review paper will have a lot of references, they consider that to be suspicious, because that's typically of someone trying to boost somebody else's H index. So yes, it is scary, and of course you could try to argue with your funding agencies whether it is healthy to have a single entity deciding whether something is good or bad, especially since some of these criteria are relatively non-transparent.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Lucia, you had a question?
I have a smaller one. What's your opinion about MDPY in comparison because of the situation of Hindawi? I am aware about a similar situation because many of our Uruguayan researchers are taking the path of MDPI because all the reasons that you gave before. So what's your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I should be very careful. I'm associated with a different a different publisher. Obviously, I should emphasize I'm not employed by Elsevier, but Elsevier is an old company, meaning they have a tradition and has a business model that is so diverse that they don't have to rely on one or a few journals. I think MDPI is very aggressive, very modern, very agile, as it's called, for many reasons. One of them being, first of all, that it's a young organization, so they don't have huge numbers of managers and people who are developing things or what have you. They have outsourced almost all their work to China, so they do it with cheap labor. And last but not least, they have almost exclusively in-house editors. So they have very few editors from outside from the scientific world, so everybody is inside. That also means that they will only do one revision on a paper. They will never go up to, like sometimes we have 6 or 7 or even 8 revisions on a paper because we want to have it perfect. They don't have the luxury of being able to do so because they need to make money. So they will accept the paper or reject the paper after one submission. One revision. And I think in the long run, you're probably better off of having a journal that allows for more than one revision. Secondly, I'm sort of a little hesitant about their many suggestions because many suggestions for including their own journals into the references. I find that unethical. And last but not least, I find it somewhat questionable that when you're a reviewer for that, you will get a voucher for a future paper in their journal, and it's only valid for a certain amount of time. All by added up, I think the model is very aggressive. I think the other publishers are envious on their model. They would like to do so, but they don't dare to because they're afraid that things might collapse. And once again, just like with the other papers from that have been delisted by Clarivate, if you lose your impact factor, you basically lose the faith in your journal, and it's very, very, very difficult to get back your impact factor, and especially the faith from the readers and the authors of that journal. So if anything happens like with Hindawi, that would be a disaster for MDPI. I hope for them it's not that bad, but I do know that some of the journals have some issues.
Okay, thank you. Another question?
I would like to do one.
Go ahead, Martin.
Okay. Thank you, Henry, for the presentation. The question that comes up to my mind is about the system of publication. I mean, how sustainable is the system? Yes, do you understand my question?
How stable is the system?
How sustainable is
How
the
sustainable?
system? Yes.
Which one of them? Because in my
Because
opinion, there
I
are
need to
three
pay to publish. Yes.
Mhm.
And at the same time, in Uruguay, we are a low-income country. So my question is, me as a researcher, I need to publish, but at the same time, I need to pay. So it can be, I mean, my question is in line with the question of Ricardo. So
Yeah, how
I
sustainable
have a
is it?
clear future of what we could do. Yeah.
I think it would be nice if I mean, if you ask me from sort of my sort of scientific point of view, I think that we should all have equal opportunities in terms of publish. Okay, that is the case with the hybrid journals, where if you don't pay to publish, we all have the same opportunity to publish. But we could have the same thing with the open access. And then we just have to find some way of normalizing the so-called APC. That would be the money you pay to publish your paper. But UNESCO, being sort of the unique place to do that, didn't dare to make any suggestions of how to normalize it. You could have said, for instance, well, you know, it should be weighted by the GDP of a country, for instance. That if a company says, well, it's 5,000 to publish a paper, then it means that if you're coming from the US, you pay 5,000. But if you come from Uruguay, then you take the GDP per and let's say per scientist in a country, and then you would make some kind of a normalization to I don't know what kind of scientist you are, but it's it's called renormalization. But nobody has dared to make that statement. And as a matter of fact, what happens now is that all the commercial publishers, they make individual, hopefully countrywide, but not always the case, contracts with various countries. And in some countries, it includes so many open slots for open access papers. And in other countries, it only includes access to all journals that they publish. I think Uruguay has a contract with Elsevier, but only for access to journals and not for the open access for free in publishing in Elsevier. So yeah, it would be nice if someone could come up with some brilliant idea of how to normalize that. Because in reality, and then I'll say something that is probably not very politically correct, but for many years, China has been benefiting from very low, because their economy has been growing so rapidly, that the pricing of their subscriptions and the pricing of their open access has always been lagging behind the real economy. Now, as a matter of fact, these days, the Chinese economy is slowing down very dramatically for them, meaning it's only increasing with about 4 or 5%, which most countries in the world would be happy with. But now everything is catching up with the scientists in terms of cost of doing science. So yeah, I would suggest if someone has a good idea how to normalize this, so everybody has a reasonable fee to access the papers. However, that would end up meaning that the APC, because obviously the journals need money to operate, that the APCs would increase dramatically for the high-income countries in the world, being the Germanys, the Netherlands, the United States, what have you. and they may then choose not to go for the gold open access. So it's all about a business model on the one side, and on the other side, a matter of how badly do you want to publish. But it should never be, that's intention from UNESCO, and there's also the intention from Plan S, that you as an author would have to go out and find the money yourself. So it's not a matter of you buying a car or buying a gold open access paper.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, I put up a QR code, so if you want to contact me, it's probably even my private email. I don't know, I don't remember. So go ahead, but otherwise I'll send the PDF around. And once again, if you want to have access to the recordings, not that I said much different from what was said in the slides, then please feel free to contact me, and I'll make the recording available. Any more questions? I thought Lucia had a question, but then she decided not to.
Lucia is writing on the chat.
No.
Thank you very much.
Yes, yes. Sorry. Sorry, Ricardo, I interrupt you. No, I just wanted to thank you for the talk. I entered late because I was busy, but I'm very interested on the presentation and the recording, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I will send a link to the recording some way or another. Maybe I'll even put it on YouTube, who knows. I'll redact it first, so and then I'll see whether I should bleep out some things, and because depending on how the election goes in the US, I might have to hide for a while. But nevertheless, thank you for the comment, and I'm willing to discuss it further. Also, if you at some point have something that applies to all of you, if you think that some of the things that we've been discussing you would like to have elaborated a little bit more, it's not a huge issue for me to set up these Zoom meetings. So if you want, be my guest, and obviously I hope to be back in Uruguay and hope to be there a little longer than the less than 48 hours, because we got caught short because of problems in the one end, and we got caught short on the other end, and it was all the fault of the Argentinians and their airline. But according to their president, if I should believe him, that airline will be sold to some commercial company, and of course it will all get much better.
Okay, Henry, once again, thanks for your time, for your presentation. So let's keep in touch.
Yes, we'll keep in touch, and welcome to the future.
Thanks to you.
Okay, thank you very much,
okay,
everybody,
people.
and
Thank
hope
you.
to see you back sometime. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.